Hello, everyone. I'm David Marler from Rotterdam UAS, and welcome to this miniature web lecture for the course Culture and Literature 2, British Culture and Literature. And today's topic is Parliament and Government, where we're going to be discussing various aspects of British governance. The objectives for this web lecture are the following. The students can describe the difference between the roles of the British Parliament and the British government. The students can describe how someone can become an MP or peer. The students can describe the seating arrangements in the House of Commons. And the students can describe the differences between the general elections in the Netherlands and in Britain, and can describe what the effect is of the first past the post system. And essentially, this web lecture is going to be based on terminology. So for the purpose of this, you're going to be getting a lot of the terms that we'll discuss later when we have our online lecture. So let's start with the terminology. The first term most of you know is the Prime Minister, and he's often called the PM. And the traditional phrase describes the position of the PM within the cabinet as primus inter pares, or Latin for first among equals. But in fact, he is much more powerful than most of the ministers. However, there is no provision under the law for the Prime Minister. He or she still yields large amounts of power. Now, the PM lives at 10 Downing Street, and often when his office makes an announcement, the term number 10 Downing Street will be used. So when you hear Downing Street, you'll often be referring to the Prime Minister, although it must be said that, for instance, the Exchequer also lives right next door. So 10 Downing Street is the official residence of the Prime Minister. It's an example of the traditional fiction that prime ministers are not especially important people, as you can see. It's also important to note that this is where the cabinet will meet and that the prime minister lives upstairs. Now, the next word that we're going to look at is the word government. And this is important because within different English-speaking countries, the word government is used in a different way. When the media talk about the government, they usually mean one of two terms. One meaning refers to all the politicians who run government departments, and there are several politicians in each department. There are normally about 100 or so members of the government in this sense. So these are generally what we would call ministers or secretaries, and they work for ministries or departments. Unlike in the United States and in some countries in Europe, it is rare for a person outside the parliament to become a minister. The other meaning of the term government is more limited. It refers only to the most powerful of these politicians, namely the Prime Minister and other members of his cabinet. The cabinet is the next term that we have, and these are the most important ministers or secretaries who are in charge of a single branch of the government. So, for instance, when I was talking about the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that would be someone who's in charge of a large ministry. Same as, for instance, the Minister of Public Health or the Chancellor of the Exchequers, which is another term for the Minister of Finance. So this term government is different when compared to a lot of countries. And the first question that you're going to prepare is, what is the meaning of government? So the word government has two translations in Dutch. What are these translations, and what is the difference between the two? The next term that we're going to look at is the civil service. For those who belong to it, the British civil service is a career. Its most senior positions are usually filled by people who have been working in it for 20 years or more. It's because of the civil service is a technocratical system. The ministers and secretaries fulfill a political position within the government. Their job is to run the government from a political and ideological standpoint. Parliament makes laws, and their job is to ensure that the state enforces the laws made by the body politic. The civil service are the people who manage the government. Often they are highly trained people within their fields, and this is common in many countries. For instance, you can think of ambassadors, but you can also think of people who work for the tax service. So, for instance, a minister or a secretary who is a political appointee, who is a member of parliament, may be in charge of taking the laws that parliament makes, making sure that they are carried out by the various branches of government, But the civil servants, or the people within the civil service, are the ones that really make sure that the government runs. Their positions don't change. So when an election comes, if a new political party comes into power, the political ministers and the secretaries, they will of course lose their jobs, but the civil servants stay in place. Now the next term that we're going to look at is the term Whitehall. Whitehall is a form of what we would call metonymy. We also hear this with Hollywood or the Crown. Metonymy is when we look at the name of a thing and it's used to refer to a different, larger thing. So Whitehall is, of course, just the name of a street in London that runs from Trafalgar Square to the Houses of Parliament. But many government departments are located on the streets running off it, and as such, the term Whitehall is often used to refer to the administrative aspects of government. So the phrase, the opinion of Whitehall, as you'll read in your book, refers to opinions of senior civil servants and other administrators. For question 2, you're going to look at local government on pages 89 to 91. You're going to answer the following question. How does the local government work in comparison to the national government, and is this the same or different from the Netherlands? Now, the next term that we're going to look at is the Palace of Westminster. The Parliament is often referred to as the Palace of Westminster because that's the name of the building. The Parliament includes two main houses. The House of Commons is an elected body that makes the laws. The House of Commons is often referred to as the lower house. It is the House of Common People. The House of Lords, on the other hand, is the upper chamber and has much stricter rules of decorum. The House of Lords is appointed and therefore not a democratic body. First, we're going to look at the House of Commons. The House of Commons is the sole elected body of the Parliament. This essentially means that the British system is a unicameral system. That means that there's really only one chamber that makes the laws. The House of Lords, which we'll come to in a moment, does not really have much power. It's important to remember that the Prime Minister is an elected member of the House of Commons. The House of Commons consists of 650 people that are called MPs, or members of Parliament. Each MP is elected to represent a constituency. This is drastically different from the many democracies in Western Europe where there is proportional democracies. This means that the UK has been sectioned off into 650 different districts, and each of these districts elects a member of Parliament. Now, the most important person in the House of Commons is arguably the Speaker. The Speaker sits in the center, high upon his chair, and has one sole job, regulating the discussion and debate in Parliament. Much like the Speaker in most democratic chambers, the Speaker of the House is supposed to be impartial. To the right of the Speaker sits the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister always sits across from something called the dispatch box. When the Prime Minister has permission to speak, he or she stands and speaks at the box, which has a microphone in front of it. To the left of the Prime Minister are the front benchers. They are called that because they are the closest to the Prime Minister, but also because these are the most important members of the government, the cabinet. They often include the ministers and secretaries, and sometimes people called whips. A whip is someone who ensures that the entire party follows the rules of the party top. Behind the front benchers are the backbenchers. The backbenchers hold lesser positions in the Parliament. They may be newer members of Parliament, have fewer years of experience, or they simply don't hold a ministerial position. They are responsible for their own district but also hold a vital position, namely, they vote on issues that are important. Directly across from the Prime Minister sits the leader of the opposition. Also on the opposition, there are frontbenchers and backbenchers. People sitting directly around the leader of the opposition are called the shadow cabinet. Above the Speaker in the gallery sits the general public, and above the governing party or the opposition parties sits members of their public. An important object to look at is this ceremonial mace. A ceremonial mace is a highly ornamented staff of metal or wood carried before a sovereign or other high members of the civil ceremonies, often called a mace bearer. Now, in the House of Commons, the mace is laid on the table to remind everyone that the decisions are being made in the name of Her Majesty the Queen. The next aspect of the House of Commons that we're going to look at is the question time. As you read in the book, this is the best attended and usually the noisiest part of the parliamentary day. For about an hour or so, there is no subject for debate. Instead, members of Parliament are allowed to ask questions of government ministers. In this way, they can, in theory at least, force the government to make certain facts public and to make its intentions clear. Opposition members of Parliament in particular have an opportunity to make government ministers look incompetent or perhaps dishonest. We're going to take a moment now to look at an example of question time.
Attack on the United States bases in Iraq, can the Prime Minister confirm that he opposes any further retaliation or escalation in violence in a situation where the region is in real risk of going into a full-scale war?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course I can confirm that, and I can point out to the right honourable gentleman that the United Kingdom has been working solidly since the crisis began to bring together, in particular, our European allies in their response. And the House will have noted the E3 declaration that was issued by France, Germany and the United Kingdom, in which we drew particular attention to the baleful role played in the region for a very long time by Qasem Soleimani, and that was a collective European view, but a view that doesn't yet appear to be shared by the right honourable gentleman. I've been interested in all his commentary that he hasn't yet raised that matter.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, following the government's support for the United States over the assassination of General Soleimani, is the Prime Minister confident that United Kingdom troops and civilians are not at further risk in the region and beyond?
Mr. Speaker, I can of course confirm, and that's an important question, that as far as we can tell, and there were no casualties last night sustained by the US, and no British personnel were injured in the attacks. And we are doing everything we can, of course, to protect UK interests in the region, with HMS Defender and HMS Montrose operating in an enhanced state of readiness to protect shipping in the Gulf. And as the House heard yesterday from my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Defence, we've relocated non-essential personnel from Baghdad to Taji, and we will do everything that we can to prevent an escalation.
Jeremy Corbyn.
The government has said that it's sympathetic to the assassination of General Soleimani. What evidence has the Prime Minister got to suggest that this attack on him and his death was not an illegal act by the United States?
Well, Mr. Speaker, clearly the strict issue of legality is not for the UK to determine, since it was not our operation. But I think that most reasonable people would accept that the United States has a right to protect its bases and its personnel. And I would remind the House that the individual concerned, Qasem Soleimani, was not only responsible for many years, amongst other things, arming the Houthis with missiles with which they attacked innocent civilians, arming Hezbollah with missiles which again they used to attack innocent civilians, sustaining the Assad regime in Syria, one of the most brutal and barbaric regimes in the world, and of course supplying improvised explosive devices to terrorists who, I'm afraid, killed and maimed British troops. That man had the blood of British troops on his hands.
Mr. Speaker, if we stand by international law, as I'm sure the government does and would want to, then surely killing somebody in a foreign territory is an illegal act and should be condemned as such. If we believe in international law, that should be the solution to the problems in the world. And as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, could the government say what representations have been made to ensure that the Iranian officials that want to attend the Security Council in order to try to bring about a resolution to the very dangerous situation in the region will be allowed to attend, and in the event of the US administration blocking them, what representations will he personally make to President Trump to make sure the UN can operate in the way that it should and must be able to operate?
I think the right honourable gentleman is probably well aware that the United States has a duty under international law to allow people to visit the UN, and that is indeed the position that the UK supports.
Your third question is about question time. How does question time differ from general debates in the Dutch Parliament? What are the similarities and differences? The next house that we're going to look at is the upper house, or the House of Lords. The House of Lords is a stark contrast to the House of Commons. The House of Lords is ruled by very strict behavior guidelines that we often call decorum. The main role of the House of Lords is to debate bills that have been passed by the House of Commons. The House of Lords cannot make laws, nor can they really prevent bills from becoming law. At most, the House of Lords can slow down the process of bill becoming a law by debating it and asking questions to the House of Commons. This is most likely because the House of Lords is an extremely undemocratic institution. And it consists of two different groups. The first one is the Lords Spiritual. The Lords Spiritual consists of 26 bishops of the Church of England that sit in the House of Lords, namely the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, the Bishops of London, Durham, and Winchester, and the next 21 most senior diocesan bishops. The next that we have are the Lords Temporal, and these are actually broken down into two groups. The Lords Temporal, the first one is what we call the hereditary peers. These are members of old aristocratic families that still hold the right to sit in the House of Lords. Until 1999, there were several of these hereditary peers, but the number has been severely reduced since then. The second group is called live peers. These peers are officially appointed by the Queen and take the title Lord or Lady, but are just normal lay people. In reality, the Prime Minister and various parties in Parliament appoint these peers to the House of Lords. It is a custom that the ruling party allows opposition parties to appoint peers to the House of Lords so that there is some semblance of diversity. Question 4 is with regards to the upper chambers. List 3 differences between the House of Lords and the Dutch upper chamber, the Senate or the Eerste Kamer. The 3 questions that you need to focus on are how they are chosen or elected, how long do they serve, and what power does each body have. Make sure to look in your book to find information about the English Parliament or the British Parliament, and also to look online if you need some information about how the Dutch Eerste Kamer is elected. The next section that we're going to look at is British elections. Elections in the UK are drastically different from elections in many other countries. In many ways, the British elections most resemble elections held in other English-speaking countries. This is, of course, because the British system has influenced the parliamentary system of many countries that were once in the British Empire. To people in Western Europe, the British system of elections is very complicated. In this section, we'll try to examine how elections work. Now, the British system runs on something that we call the first-past-the-post voting system, and it's based on something called a constituency. Now, in Dutch, the word constituency means kiesdistrict, and in the UK, there are 650 constituencies, and each constituency, which is a physical area of the UK, elects one member of Parliament. Now, each district, in theory, has a similar number of residents. So as you can see, London, which is a city of millions of people, has a lot of very small constituencies, as you can see around other large cities, for instance, Manchester. If you go up to the north of Scotland, you'll see that the constituencies are much larger because they are sparsely populated. Now, each votes for a person from several parties, and the person who gets the most votes wins. That's why we call it first past the post. It does not mean that that person necessarily had 50%. In most cases in the UK, the person does not get 50% of the vote. Now, this is in stark contrast to the other system that a lot of countries, including the Netherlands, use, which is called proportional representation. Now, in this case, the parliament is given a certain number of votes. In the Netherlands, it's 150. All votes are counted, and each party is given a proportion of the votes. Now, we're going to look at two scenarios really quickly to see how these systems work and how voting and the amount of seats in parliament can be very different. So we're going to look at two constituencies with four imaginary parties: the Left Party, the Right Party, the Green Party, and the Populist Party. Now, in constituency 1, we see that it's very clear that the Green Party, with its 16,000 votes, won, which means that the Green Party is going to, of course, win the election. In the second constituency, we see that the Populist Party, also with 16,000 votes, is going to win the election. And that means that if we look at a parliament in which 60% of the constituencies voted exactly like our scenario number 1, and 40% voted exactly like scenario 2, that 390 seats would go to the Green Party and 260 seats would go to the Populist Party. But if we actually tally up the votes, we'll see that the Left Party, the Right Party, and the Green Party both got 22% of the votes nationwide, and the Populist Party got 33% of the votes. And yet the Green Party won more seats because the rest of the votes within each constituency don't count. And this is the same thing that we see if we compare this, for instance, to a scenario of proportional representation. In this system, the Left Party got 22% of the votes, so they would get 143 seats. The Right got 22, so they'd also get 143. The Green had 22, and they would get 143. And the Populist, which got 33% of the votes, if we add constituency 1 and 2 together, they would get 214 seats. So what we can see here is that when we have the first past the post system, that we tend to have two-party politics. That is one of the reasons why in the United Kingdom and in countries like the United States, they tend to always have two parties, and a lot of times in Parliament, you're going to have that one party gets more than 50% of the votes, so they have total control of Parliament, as is the case right now in the UK with the Tories or the Conservative Party. That means that our last question, question 5, is going to be about the pros and the cons of this. At first, when we look at the first past the post system, it appears that this would be very bad. But in many ways, some political scientists say that there are a lot of benefits to this system. And I want you to look up these benefits online and also think, of course, of why this system is not necessarily that great and why proportional voting systems are much better. So for question 5, I want you to think about the pros and the cons of the first past the post system. This is the end of this web lecture, and I will see you all in class.